Dr. Jazz.
Thanks for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Dr. Jazz.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, I've listened to your music for quite some time, and
Oh, wow.
I love your records. Already going back to John Taylor and that stuff. I want to talk about that
Oh,
later, but
wow.
that's playing
Oh,
with
thank
some
you.
of
That's
my
very
favorite
nice.
musicians. Yeah, but
Oh,
I want to start this talk with the latest one. I listened to Stars and Constellations, and man, it's a masterpiece. It's like, I mean, I love your kind of
oh,
smaller ensembles, I'll put it like that, music, and but this one is so beautiful, and there's like on Bandcamp the whole story written how you composed it, and uh, inspired by many different things. And what's the idea behind the record? I mean, first of all.
well, there were some really nice liner notes by Michael Allman. That was fun to work with him on that. But yeah, the idea for this was one of my first records was with string quartet and trio with Mark Helias and Jim Black, and a string quartet that my violinist friend Natalie Bonin, who I still work with, she put together the quartet, and I really liked that format. I grew up listening to a lot of string quartet music. Bartok was a huge influence early on, and I love the vitality and the folk elements in there. And I saw a connection between that and sort of I was at that period, like must have been like 16, 17. I was like super into John Coltrane, the sort of early to late 60s work. And I sort of heard this connection between just the energy that was coming, the intensity and the energy and the focus from both those artists. And I wanted to try to kind of connect it in some way because of these two things that I loved. So many years ago, one of my first records, I did that, and it was much more coming out of my jazz training and more set pieces and that kind of concept. And I wanted to revisit it now that I've written my own string quartet, I've written a violin concerto. I work with strings a lot for decades now, studied more, learn more. So it's kind of that exploration, and the pieces ended up being a lot more long form because that's more what I've been exploring lately, is really playing with form. Instead of having a really short piece where the improvisation fits in a very specific way, I wanted to see how I could, weave this in a more longer form where the form changes and adapts and tells more of a long narrative. So that was kind of the idea behind it. And then this other element that's sort of been in my music the last 10 years is I've been working with this physicist, Dr. Stephen Morris.
Yeah, I've read about it. Yeah,
whose area of his area of research is patterns in nature. We just finished a giant project that will be coming out next year where we really focused on his work. I wrote for a chamber orchestra and commissioned 4 filmmakers, like for a different area of his research. But this string record, it still has some of those influences. So he helped me do a 3D model of one of the constellations.
Oh wow!
Sort of one of the themes for the bookend pieces are the zodiac signs. I mean, I didn't want to go too deep into it because it's not.
Yeah.
I just like the narrative and mythical aspects of it, and then connecting that to more of an actual scientific grounding for some of it. So for the Sagittarius, the last piece, we used some of the actual data from where the stars are located and turned it into a 3D model, and I could manipulate that and play with that to come up with melodic ideas or rhythmic ideas. I could map it however I wanted, and then I still use that sort of how I would see Bartok using folk music. Like he went around and he, like one of the earliest ethnomusicologists, he'd record all these folk melodies, but then he's not, it's not, here's my folk melody, and he very, very much blended it in and wove it into his own style and sound. And so that's how I'm approaching this. Or like Messiaen, how he used bird calls. He went around, transcribed all the birds in his neighborhood and then wove that into his music. But you would never if you didn't know to
No.
look for that,
Yeah,
I
sure.
don't think it would like jump out as like, oh my God, there's like a million bird songs in this thing. But it's an interesting, for me, that's just like as a composer, that's something interesting to explore. And it gives me, sends me in different directions than if I was just sitting there with pen and
Exactly.
paper, which I also enjoy doing too.
No. We need something,
Sorry.
right? To get inspired. Like it's good that you have that. I mean, where does this interest for astrophysics come from with you? I mean,
Well, I've always been interested in science. Like sort of at the crossroads early on, I was interested in going into computer science or artificial intelligence, actually, which is really huge now all of a sudden. But at the time, I was reading lots of books from professors at MIT and very interested and curious about this. So I've always been fascinated by math. And it was kind of by fluke that I met Stephen and I love the idea of incorporating things that are in the natural environment. That's very much how artists, painters, and we're always as humans, we're inspired by that. But I like taking a little more the physics element or that analytical way of looking at it gives something, just a different way of looking at it. But for me, I connect with that.
Yeah.
So
those were sort of. You mentioned long forms. When I listened, like there's like almost 20 minutes long tunes and Dan is on the drums, which is, of course, he's one of the best out there. But like, how did it work with strings? Strings can be sometimes tricky with rhythms, and when I hear, your music is rhythmically really intricate, I think, and it's going, so many ways. Like, how was it like working with strings?
String quartets have come a long way from even, again, like 20, 30 years ago. The training is really different. They're much more focused on that. I mean, just alone, the minimalist movement alone has really shaped how they practice things. So I think that's changed a lot. And they're improvising too. Like both string quartets that I worked with were comfortable in, I mean, they're not coming out of the jazz tradition, but in their tradition, I could say, improvise in this idea or this soundscape or use these aleatoric elements. I mean, it becomes a little bit political in that for me, in that like I'm bridging these different groups together, and it's important to find commonality. And I think that's sort of what I've always sort of looked for in my music, is to how can we find common ground and make something sort of different, fresh, and interesting together. And so yeah, we had to work hard. I mean, it's challenging music. We worked hard, but I knew that I could give challenging written stuff to the strings and they would really work hard at it and get it together. And Dan is a great complement to that because he knew when he just knew, he knew when to give that really strong foundation that the strings could layer on, and then he knew where he could do his thing. So
yeah, exactly.
And I try to be aware of that and conscious of that in structuring the pieces too, so that everybody had room to be themselves.
Yeah, beautiful. And the other part of the trio is Mark Helias, and I mean I had a chance to play and record with Mark like in 2004, and he's just a monster on the instrument. And you have such a long story with him as well. Like, how did you meet and your story with him? I mean, he's the older generation, of course, now. So
yeah, don't tell him that. No,
I don't.
Young at heart for sure.
Mark, you're young at heart. So
yeah. No, I was really lucky. A friend of mine, or a couple of friends of mine, studied with him. Michael Bates and Michael Herring. They were coming to I was in Toronto at that time, and they were going to New York to study with him, and they put me in touch because I'd heard him on recordings, and they raved about working with him. So I had him on that first string record, I think around 2004 or something like that. And we had a good time, really good time. And then I've used them on a bunch of subsequent projects. We did a trio record with Dan and Mark a bunch of years ago, and we did a few short little tour that was super fun. Yeah, and actually we have I have a duo record with him, just improvised duo record in the can that I'm just about to finish mixing him, which was also super fun. It was a nice contrast because usually I've got so much written music for him, and he's like, we're all turning lots of pages. So this was a nice release from that too. But with somebody like him, it's always important. He can do the art. For me, it's such a great blend because he can do all the challenging written Arco stuff and sound like a classical bass player when required, then do all the improvising stuff, have a great feel. And he's just so creative with it. Like the improviser's mentality, like every night, the solos are going to be completely different or different approach. So
yeah, he's that generation, like Mark Dresser and Drew Grass. Well, he's a little bit younger, but yeah, I mean that kind of vein. I love that when they can read everything and improvise. Like, I mean, obviously,
yeah, and it's a great story. Stories connecting to the history. It's great. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, you mentioned you were in Toronto. Like, what got you excited for jazz? Actually, you mentioned Coltrane before, but I don't know, when was that? Like mid '80s, late '80s? Was there like a record? Or I mean, you had a huge festival, obviously, or the circuit in Canada for
Yeah, it
jazz,
wasn't
which
so much
is
festivals. I mean, for me, it was I was lucky. I got connected with a really good teacher early on. It's usually the story. Alex Dean. He's one of the heavyweights on the scene. He's just a little younger than Mark Helias, but I met him at a one of these summer jazz camps, and he was the funniest. He was like he kind of had a Robin Williams thing going too. So not only was he a great teacher, but I'd be on the floor in stitches all the time too, like with improvising jokes and stuff. So for a kid, that was perfect. And he laid all these records on me too. He's like, check this out, check this out. I remember he played Giant Steps for me like the first time, and just like my jaw hit the floor. It's like, how have I not heard this before? Yeah, and he kind of guided me. I studied with him from, I think, probably like seventh grade, and then he just gotten all through high school, and then he just gotten the teaching gig at University of Toronto. So I followed him there for a couple of years as well. So that's super important. But yeah, having and the Toronto scene is really good too. Straight ahead, but really great. I mean, it's about the same size as Chicago. Different influences and such, but there's a strong scene up there. It's a big enough city that there's plenty of great musicians to go hear any night. So.
Yeah. Did you start then playing jazz gigs? I mean, like standards and everything in Toronto, or?
Oh yeah. I did a lot of that. I taught at the University of Toronto and Humber College, and they're more in the mainstream contemporary jazz, I guess, universe. So that have did a lot of that stuff. And I was really fortunate. I got to work with Hilario Duran, amazing Cuban piano player.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Yeah.
That was really great. Got to work with him in a small group thing with David Bookbinder, who's a Jewish trumpet player. So they had a crossover klezmer Cuban mashup thing that was just so fun to play with Hilario every night. Played in his big band.
How did you end up with him? I mean,
just on the scene, like.
Okay.
It is a smaller scene, so that if you're one of the folks that are into more creative stuff, you'll get a call to do all kinds of different situations, which is great. So.
Because I mean I have you on a computer, like on a record with I think Paquito is on it there, the Rivera and El Horacio Negro, and like who's who of Latin music. I mean, how was that like to play with those guys?
Phenomenal. I mean, just the rhythm section is ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, it was amazing, and there's because Canada is a little easier for Cubans to get to for visas and immigration. There's some amazing Cuban musicians. Younger alto player Luis Denis just got a teaching gig in Brandon University. I just saw he's a phenomenal young player. I mean, young, but he's a bit younger than me.
Jazz wise, it's still young.
Yeah, it's all. But yeah, that influence is really great. I mean, here in New York is just so big. So you got to it seems that you almost have to specialize more. You don't I definitely didn't get in Toronto. There were a lot more opportunities to play in all these different situations. Here it's more, it seems there's just so many more people, so much more intent that you got to focus a little bit more. I don't know if you found that. But...
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. How did you decide actually to move to New York? What was the main trigger?
I just knew, like, well,
and when actually, I mean,
Jim Black was here, and a bunch of other artists that I really wanted to work with. David Binney was here. Lots of another great trumpet player, Russ Johnson. I got to work with a bunch was here, and just a lot of the musicians that I was really inspired by. we're all here. And so I at least wanted to spend some time here. I came here in 99 till 2001, lived up in Washington Heights. But it's really challenging as a Canadian to get papers to work like anywhere else, like anybody else. There's no special treatment or anything. So yeah, I couldn't get the paperwork that I needed. So I went back after September 11th. That was a little bit of uncertainty at that point too, as to how things were going to work out. But with it, I went back in mind knowing what I needed to get for the visas. So I did a bunch of leader work where I would get press and I collect it all, and it's sort of gearing it towards what I would need for this. The thing is called an alien of extraordinary ability. That's what you need to get first as an artist visa. Maybe you have done this. The O1 is the artist visa first, but then you can, very similar process, but just more of it. You can go for your green card, and that's what I eventually did. And so now I'm in the pretty very happy place of being a dual citizen. Canada allows that, and the US allows it. So I get to vote here. I get to vote at both places. It's just easy going over the border and lets me work in both places.
Was it heavy for you when you came to New York first? I mean, what were the first connections that you made, actually? I mean, you mentioned Mark and Jim, actually, but...
Well, I mean, the first few years are challenging. New York is tough. I mean, I did a lot of teaching. I thankfully hooked up a gig at the Brooklyn Conservatory doing some teaching like clarinet group classes. I mean, that was a change from teaching. I mean, I was teaching at two of the sort of top colleges or universities in Toronto, in Canada. Going from that to like, this is a reed. This goes on the clarinet. Stop sticking it up your nose. That's that was. But in some ways, I really enjoyed it because every week the kids would come in and they're super excited about music. Like you don't see that. I mean, after you just don't see that in college, the same excitement about music week to week. I mean, people are excited and then focused on what they're doing, but it doesn't have that. Like kids around 10, 11, like every week, they went from playing nothing at the beginning of the year to playing pieces. And that was really cool to actually be a part of that. So I did a bunch of that, I mean, you take whatever gigs you can for the first bit. And so I was doing a bunch of big band things, different small group things, whatever came along.
Yeah. I mean, Magic Numbers, which you mentioned Jim and the string quartet and Mark, that you were still in Canada? No, you were already in New York,
right? I was still in Canada at that point.
Still in Canada. Oh, okay.
I mean, that was after my first trip to New York. So that was around 2004, 2006. I think I wrote the music around 2004, 2003, 2004. So
interesting. How did you then?
I brought them up. We did it.
Yeah. No, I wanted to ask you your connection with David Binney also. I mean, I love those records, Flux and Forward Motion, that you did. I mean, Kenny and I Matt Mitchell, and like, how did you hook up with those guys and that group of creative?
Well, I did a bunch of side band things with Binney. My bass player I mentioned, Michael Herring. He got Binney on a bunch of gigs. We did a couple of records with him and some tours, so got to know him and know that we had a nice connection playing together and fun hang. And always loved his music. Was like super original.
I love it. Yeah.
Creative and all the good stuff. So when I came time to sort of put a smaller group thing together, I just asked him if he would do it and wrote some music for that band. And Matt Mitchell had just sort of hit the scene. I heard him with Tim Byrne. And it was like, this is the right guy to play my crazy music. So he just stepped in and was able to deal with this really complicated music, no problem, and got all the influences. And I mean, he's just a monster musician. And that, outside of New York, they're few and far between that can, here there's several,
crazy,
a couple
right?
of folks that can deal, but outside of New York, it's a challenge to get somebody with that breadth that can improvise that well, that can read music at that level. Is really, that's why he's doing all the things he's doing here.
Yeah, Matt is crazy. Yeah, he's really. I did this talk with him like, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and I was like, "What are you doing now?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm thinking how to play, I don't know, 19 over 15 in quadruplets or something." I was like, "What are you talking about?" Like, and it
You know,
completely
that's
made
just for fun. That's like he
yeah,
does
yeah,
that. Like, he
yeah.
gets up and eats cereal and does that. You know.
That's how did you get excited with this? I'll say complicated music, or like you know, and you being comfortable in that zone when I listen you improvise over your forms, and you
Mhm.
seem to be very at ease. At least that's how I hear. I mean, how do you get comfortable with your forms or uh, any other odd meter form? Let's put it like that. Or
Just, I mean, it's just practicing and
mm,
exposing yourself to it. And just for me, it's kind of it's always to serve the narrative of. I mean, I'm just such a composer that I'm always thinking about. You know, if I'm going to do something complex, is it serving the purpose of what I'm trying to, the bigger gesture of what I'm trying to get across? But when I'm practicing, I'll practice very specific things
mm,
like what you're saying. Like, okay, how can I get the 7/5 and get that to feel really good and move it into different limbs and get the line, you know, how can I get the lines to shape that way? And, you know, I'll work on it as something like a very specific kind of exercise and then work on that for a while until it feels comfortable, you know, and juggle a few of those different ideas. And then it's more like, well, how would that work if I use that here against this other thing? What would that sound like? And so I'll try it. And
mm,
so a lot of experimenting, exploring,
mm,
and just basic practicing. It's always, for me, it's always like balancing getting deeper in the fundamentals and then pushing myself to do things that I can't do yet. So it's always like getting a deeper groove or getting a deeper sound. It's like this just never ending working on fundamentals to a degree too. And it's for me, it's always trying to get that push and pull and that balance of like deeper into the history and the fundamentals and then pushing into new language and you know things that I can't do.
mm. And you as a composer, how do you end up with like, you know, you basically follow the melodic line, or what's your process there? I mean, like that you end up with, you know.
It'll vary. I mean, it depends. I sort of try to come up with an idea for the piece. So each piece will have a, for example, on the record, pendulum
Yeah.
uh, is all based on the physics of a pendulum. So the piece, I knew I wanted it to be, you know, 14 minutes long, and then I mapped out. Thankfully, I have some
Mm,
software now that helps me do this. Before, I would be laboriously spending hours doing the calculations on this stuff. But now there's some really good software that helps with that kind of thing. So the piece starts off as a swinging pendulum from one side to the other side. And I wanted two string quartets. One would represent one side, one the other side, kind of a yin yang idea where one
mhm,
is, if one is active, the other one isn't active. Harmonically, that mapped as well. One was things were brighter, things were darker, and then sort of in the middle, where we end up settling, it's somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. And so that was kind of the guiding principle for the whole piece. And then that would shift in terms of uh, how busy Dan was throughout the piece. I gave him a rhythmic grid, which is a little
mm,
different.
okay.
Generally don't hand somebody a drum part and a rhythmic grid but that gave him something different to sort of play off of. And also I like things where sometimes I don't have to be so specific. I can give him a rhythmic grid and he can do whatever he wants around that. It's sort of guiding him, but then he has freedom to contribute as well. And I like that idea and return to that kind of principle a lot. So given now I knew my big structure form, so then I got to sort of set some milestones within the piece that I wanted to happen, like where, you know, how we would be conversing between the saxophone and the string quartets, and when the string quartets would have a moment, and then when the drums would have more of a moment, where the bass would have more of a moment. So kind of like, you know, getting back to like how Bartok used the folk music, how Messiaen used birdsong, that's kind of the guiding principle. But then, you know, I'm still, when I'm writing, I'm still improvising along with it. I try to leave room so that everything isn't all mapped out or
Yeah.
calculated. So I can respond as like melodic ideas come up. I'll respond to that, or I'll infuse it with other little quotes or little things that, you know, seem, you know, that day that I'm writing, that's what's coming to me and feeling like it wants to go there. So
Mm,
there's a lot of that as well. I could only rationalize why I chose that after the fact. It's very much like improvising. Like we could talk about it forever, but when you're in the actual act of
yeah.
doing it, it seems a different part of the brain, a different part of the process. So I'm more trying to figure out what I was doing after the fact sometimes when I talk about it. But
Mm.
I do find I generally always try to lay out the form,
Map it.
have some
Yeah.
milestones of what's
Yeah.
going to happen, because then it's kind of then I know how the story is going to go in a way, and then I can react to it and work around that, especially on these longer form
Yeah,
pieces,
that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
like where it's not. I like writing, shorter, more song form as well. I got a small group record that's coming out that's a little bit more in that universe. But for these more orchestral inspired or more uh, uh, leaning a little more into the classical inspired, that's how I'm looking at the form and looking at writing.
Yeah, no, I want to ask. I'm fascinated by these long forms because sometimes when I start writing, you can easily get lost unless you map it out like really clearly where you want to go. I mean, it's 20 minutes.
Especially for
That's a lot.
deadline now too. That's the worst. Like sometimes it's really fun and you can fun and revealing if you have the time to do some of that, because you'll end up with things that you wouldn't get if you do map it all out. But I find now, I have project deadlines that this project needs to be. I mean, I got to have music in front of people at this point, so I can't. I have to be pretty disciplined about it. And I still like to leave, as I said, I like to leave room for some of that, because otherwise, it just seems too formulated. But
do you write like on a daily basis also? Compose, I mean, like snippets and write them down and then you archive them?
Yeah, no, I kind of have to but it'll be project based. So like I've just finished this giant project with a physicist, and that was basically a year of between the logistics and the writing. That was, it would be maintenance practice at the end of the day. Everything else would be writing for this large. It just takes that much time. I'm not a super quick writer, so I got to spend the hours. I got to log the hours to fighting with it and getting it to the finish line. But then once that project's done, it's like, okay, I need some time. I'm just going to be practicing for like 2 or 3 months. And that's, then we'll put the writing, if something comes to me, I'll write it down. Or if there's an idea, I'll write it down. But I kind of need, for me, it's that I need that focused energy on what I'm doing. So, and it's been really fun the last few months just to focus on practicing again. And
yeah, that's great.
problems on the piano and all that. Yeah.
You write by hand otherwise, or with computer, right? Or
kind of a combination. I mean,
really? Okay.
The computer is really helpful. I mean, I've been working with a software called Opus Modus that lets me, it's Lisp based, like an old computer programming language that lets me manipulate data, and it will spit out musical notation like XML files or MIDI. So that's new and kind of really handy. Before, it would be all laboriously doing a lot of calculating by hand. This way I could try out a lot more different options. But I really do love, for me, it's the balance too. I love writing by hand. And I studied counterpoint pretty hard. About 7 years ago, I started getting really deep in classical counterpoint. And so singing melodies, writing all the different parts by hand. So I feel that's kind of an important balance for me to not get too lost in the computer, because I love it, but I also love the more organic nature. And for me, it's really important to get that feel with the computer. I don't want the computer to feel like it's a computer, but I also like the idea of some things the computer could do that would just take freaking hours to do by, calculating by hand. So kind of finding that happy balance. But there's something really beautiful about writing pencil to paper.
Oh man.
There's some connection that you don't have, even if you just put it right into the computer.
I agree. Yeah, it's nice to write notes. I always write also first sheet paper and then put it in the computer. But it's like you said, it's something really nice and personal about it, like with a pencil and a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it seems to connect different parts of the brain for
I don't know,
reason.
Romantic.
Yeah, that too.
Also, I don't know. It's but I wanted to ask you before already, like speaking of your groups and projects, like about this John Taylor project that you did with and Ernst Reisiger also. I mean, Europeans, and how did you end up with those guys? And especially, how was John is like one of my favorite pianists ever. How was it like for you to play with him and work with him? And
oh man, it was such a treat. It's such a pleasure to get to work with him. I was just so lucky that it worked out timing wise, that he was going through some life changes. I think I know his wife had just passed not that long ago, so he was kind of looking for projects to dig into that would kind of keep him busy. So I just cold called him. I mean,
oh really? Oh wow.
He did. Yeah, he did a project with a great saxophone player in Toronto, Kirk McDonald. They'd done some touring and some playing together. He brought him over. So I got his contact info from that and just basically pitched him this project. I want to write some music. I want to do kind of a chamber thing, improvise, blah, blah, blah. I sent him, I think, one of the pieces and we just worked it out. So I brought him, we did a concert in Toronto and then did the record. And it was like that. It was a great experience just to get to hear him interpreting my music and getting to hang with him. He's loved drinking Guinness, and we had a couple of really nice hangs. And I saw him a few years later at a festival in Newfoundland, in St. John's, Newfoundland. He was the guest artist. We had a nice hang there too. We were talking about trying to do something further. It's just, as you know, booking tours are very challenging. So. And then I'm always got new projects on the go, so moved on to some other stuff. But it was amazing to get to work with him. I mean, at that time he was doing all the trio records with Peter Erskine.
Yeah, man,
and they're just some of my favorite trio records.
Yeah, mine too. Yeah, with Paula and that's killing stuff. Yeah, I love this stuff. Did you ever, you mentioned booking and touring, did you ever bring your groups to Europe, the trio, or?
I haven't yet. I've done sideman stuff in Europe. It's just really challenging to bring, as you know, a group from here is just
3 players. Yeah.
I mean, even a small, and my groups are tending to be large. Like we've got the last record is 7 people. It's just,
that's crazy.
They want to book like a duo or a solo. Most, they don't want to, I mean, it's just so expensive, and then when you start talking fees and it's challenging. So I think I've got a couple things in the works that I might use. I don't want to say anything yet because we're waiting for funding to come. But there's a couple things that look promising. Might get to work with Jim Black again over there because he's living over there.
He's in Berlin. Yeah, fantastic.
Well, I think he's actually in Switzerland now.
Oh, he's not. Oh, really? I didn't know that.
I think so. I think he was in Berlin for a long time, but I think he's teaching in Switzerland now.
Oh, really? I have to drop him a line.
Don't quote me on it. I better double check, but I think so. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well,
he's in Europe, so
he's in Europe, definitely. Yeah, for sure. What are your plans? I mean, you mentioned a duo record with Mark coming out, and what's also this small group record that you mentioned before?
Who is it with? A smaller group record with Dan and Mark, and then Yuhan Su, vibraphonist. She's on a few pieces. I did one piece that's for 2 5-octave marimbas plus the trio that I used like bird flocking patterns or murmurations. I plotted out this kind of crazy piece that actually my wife commissioned me, Vanessa Lee. She's a really good classical piano player, so she commissioned the piece originally. We premiered it, and then I had this idea all along that I'd wanted to put it on a 5-octave marimba, so it ended up like from the piano part it had to go to two 5-octave marimbas just to make it all work. And so Aaron Edgecombe was the other percussionist in the other part. So that's one of the pieces. And then the rest of the pieces were with Yuhan and then Christopher Hoffman on a few pieces as well, the great improvising cellist.
Yeah.
Just sort of finishing up I just finished up the editing. Actually, that's what I was up in Canada doing. Just finished the editing on that. And hopefully that'll come out in the fall, duo with Mark. And then the other last year was the giant science project, focusing on Dr. Stephen Morris's work, Patterns in Nature. There were 4 movements, each about 10 minutes long. We had branches, flow, cracks, and ripples. And I commissioned a different filmmaker for each movement.
Oh, wow.
It was a multi-thing. We did a premiere here in New York at Hunter College for chamber orchestra, 16-piece group with featured soloists, improvising, and also the string quartet. It's the Molinari string quartet from Montreal. So they were they didn't improvise, but had a very fierce written part for their feature. We did a premiere in Toronto as well. So I just finished doing all the editing on that, and I got to figure out how to release it with the film element.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not sure. It would be a DVD years ago, but that's with streaming.
That doesn't work.
But that'll come out hopefully at the end of this year too, or early next year.
Wow.
That was that was a lot of work.
Yeah. So, but the music will come out of this project, right? Patterns.
Oh, yeah.
from Nature. Yeah. How beautiful.
Yeah. I'll probably together. Yeah, probably separately and together with the
Yeah,
films. We did a really did a different kind of process where we collaborated with the physicist and each filmmaker while we were coming up with it. So instead of, I mean, I've done films where somebody's handed me a film. It's like, okay, come up with the music to the film. And I've also done the other thing where I've commissioned films from finished music, like the Path of Totality. I commissioned 6 little short films. And actually, the last release, I commissioned 3 little short films for Stars and Constellations with different folks. But for this Patterns from Nature project, we worked together sort of like about a month for each filmmaker and each movement, and we were kind of passing ideas back and forth, and meet with the scientists, and he'd talk about different inspirations. So that was a fun and different process. So
are you still going to promote this project somewhere this year, like this with the Patterns from Nature? Or
I have to finish mixing the music, and but probably at the end of this year or early next year. I'm hoping. So.
Which kind of leads me, like, where can people see you? I mean, what's on the schedule for you for the upcoming months, like gig-wise? Do you have some gigs coming up?
I have a couple of commissions, so I'm actually hiding out writing.
Okay.
That's the other challenge. Like when I write so much, it's to get that balance between playing and writing. I'm writing a new string quartet for the Molinari String Quartet, so I'm going to go to Montreal in May, and I have to have, we'll workshop it, but I have to have a bunch of new music written for them. And I have a upcoming string orchestra project with Florian Hoffner. It's a really good German piano player who was in New York for a while, but he's teaching in Newfoundland now in St. John's. That's going to be, I think it's going to premiere in Montreal. Just waiting. We're working with the Off Jazz Festival. Hopefully that will come together. But at least we'll be writing the music and recording it in October. So I got a busy writing year.
And records coming out. Come on, like 3 records this year, probably.
Exactly.
Beautiful,
exactly. Man. So try to keep out of trouble,
Beautiful, man. Quinsin, thanks so much for sharing some of these thoughts and
thank you, man.
About your music. Beautiful to hear you talk, how you do this stuff, Now I can connect it, re-listen again.